Everyone, this is going to be 14.8, the impact of World War II. And we're going to start from a quote on the new president, Harry Truman, and VJ Day, that is the Victory over Japan Day, where he said, "This is a victory of more than arms alone. This is a victory of liberty over tyranny." And this is really how we thought about it, or not we. I mean, I wasn't alive at the time or anything like that, but many people back then actually said it that way, which is that this is not a military victory. This is an ideological victory. Our way of life beat their way of life, not just our army beat their army. Our objectives: we're going to evaluate the goals that Allied leaders set for post-war world, describe the steps that the United States and other nations took towards international cooperation, and we're going to explain the impact of World War II on the post-war United States as well. So let's look at us trying to put together the world after the war. In February of 1945, right before his death, Roosevelt went to Yalta, and he met with the other big two, that being Stalin and Winston Churchill, to discuss what's going to happen after the war. All three agreed that countries like Poland and Bulgaria and Romania, these countries that were sort of Soviet satellite states at this point, should have free elections after the war. And Stalin promised. He made a promise, and he did not follow through on it at all. He went back on this and made them part of not necessarily the USSR, but made them part of the Soviet satellite states, made them part of the larger scope, the sphere of influence of the USSR. Now, at Potsdam in July 1945, this is where Truman has replaced Roosevelt due to Roosevelt's death. The Big Three agreed that they would temporarily divide up Germany and the capital city of Berlin after the war. And if you know anything about what happened after the war, that temporary time period ended up being about 40 years, give or take, a little bit more. So here are the Big Three at Yalta: Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. And here's what Germany looked like after the war. This is like a teaser trailer for the Cold War coming up. Germany would be divided in half, with West Germany and East Germany. And Berlin, which you might notice here, I'm going to actually zoom in on it real quick. Berlin is this little multicolored spot right here within the Russian part of East Germany. This is all going to play a really big part once we get to the Cold War and the impact of the Cold War. So let's look at the international impact of this war. After the war, many countries in Eastern Europe started to become part of the USSR, or started to fall under the influence of the USSR. To use the term that we're going to see in the next chapter, the great metaphor used by Winston Churchill, this is an iron curtain falling across the Eastern Europe. We also see that China had been having a civil war back in the 1930s, before the communists in China and the nationalists in China decided to join forces and just take on the Japanese. Now, that war's over, time for the Civil War to pick back up. And as we're going to see, the communists win in 1949. Japan was basically forced into a democracy by the United States. However, they did very well with it, and it turned out to be very successful. Japan turned out to be a great ally throughout the Cold War time period. And in general, many European countries started to give up their colonies. So we see that England is giving up their colonies, like India. Canada becomes more independent. We see that other nations are giving up their colonies. The United States gives up the Philippine Islands in 1946. And at the end of it, there are two big countries walking away from the war, much more powerful than when they walked in, and that is the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They became the two big modern superpowers and launched the world into what is going to be called the Cold War. That's where we're heading next. So let's look at international organizations and treaties of this time period. After the war, the world created the League of Nations, the second League of Nations, a hopefully better League of Nations called the United Nations. All of the great powers and a bunch of other countries joined with the idea of stopping future wars. What was different this time was that this one had, well, first of all, it had the United States, And it also had a police force that it could send around the world. So when we go to fight in the Korean War, that is not just America. Technically, that is the United Nations going to fight in Korea. Now, was it mostly the United States? Absolutely. But the United Nations was a larger, both diplomatic and police force when necessary. Our first representative was the former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. She was our delegate to the United Nations, and she ended up writing a good chunk of what is called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document that defines the rights that belong to all people in the world and tried to protect them as best they could. So here's the UN building in New York. This was not built until the 1960s. And here is the Eleanor Roosevelt statue in the Roosevelt Memorial in Washington, D.C. And it says over there next to her that she's the first U.S. Delegate to the United Nations. And the quote next to her says, "The structure of world peace cannot be the work of one man or one party or one nation. It must be a peace which rests on the cooperative effort of the whole world." Now, the Holocaust was a horrible and terrible reminder that of just the real nastiness and awfulness of this war, um, and their treatment of the Jewish people shocked the world so much so that the world put the remaining Nazis, the big ones, the higher ups, on trial for their crimes. These were at the Nuremberg trials, and they showed to the world the evils of the Third Reich, but they also wanted to be more fair than the Nazis were. So the US, the USSR, France, and England took great pains that these were fair trials. Some were executed, some received shorter sentences, life imprisonment, 10 years, 20 years, and a very, very few, were found not guilty of their crimes. So here are just some of the Nazis on trial at Nuremberg. And this set the stage for what we have today, which is a modern war crimes tribunal in the world. Now, let's look at the war at home and how it impacted us. After the war, America, like I said, was a superpower. We are an economic powerhouse. We do not see a return to the isolationism that followed World War I. We are now an actor on the world stage, and we are going to flaunt it. The president had become the most powerful person in the world, and in the country, definitely, both in domestic and foreign affairs, meaning that, the power of the presidency rose significantly during the war. And for many African Americans and other groups, many use the war as a reason to demand equal rights. This is what we call the double V. Victory against fascism and tyranny abroad means also victory against oppression at home. However, when they came home, they still found discrimination. So oftentimes the end of World War I is also seen as the beginning of the civil rights movement of this time.